to me the invitation to teach. Just a quick word about the schedule before we get into the meat of the presentation here. We're continuing to meet on Sundays following the 10 a.m. celebration of the Eucharist, just like right now. We'll continue after this week on 3 more Sundays. So today is October 2nd. We'll meet the 9th, 16th, and 23rd. And here's the schedule coming up. Today we're going to take a look at the Examen, which is a way of praying your life. Next Sunday, we'll take a look at the traditional practice of praying the Rosary, which is, among other things, a way to pray the life of Jesus. On October 16th, we'll take a look at the practice of Lectio Divina, divine reading, as the tradition says. It's a way of praying Scripture in a very deep way. And on October 23rd, we'll take a look at the Jesus Prayer, which is a way of praying the name of Christ, which has its own kind of extraordinary kind of power and wisdom to it. So that's what's coming up. Ron, should I stall for another minute or two before I actually start the...
No, I've already started the recording.
Oh, okay. Well, so much for stalling. Okay, there we go. All right. So let's take a quick look at this way of prayer known as the Examen. And again, I'll talk about how it got that name in a minute. The Examen is a way of thinking about your life. It's a method of daily, ideally you do it every day. It's a way of daily self-examination, self-evaluation. And you do it every day in an attempt to discern patterns in your life, patterns of behavior, patterns of response. And you are trying to gather that self-knowledge so that you can get better, so that you can do it better, so that you can live a wiser, if you will, more enlightened life. This is a very ancient idea. It certainly predates Christianity. The Greco-Roman philosophers, prior to and during and after the life of Christ, were fond of this idea. The Roman Stoic philosopher Seneca wrote about this. So there's nothing especially Christian per se. Well, let me say it again. We Christians did not invent this idea, but we certainly borrowed it in some interesting ways. It came into the Christian tradition as early as the late 300s. St. Basil the Great, who was writing in the late 300s, in the first golden age of Christian spirituality, St. Basil says it's good to think about your life every day, because it keeps you from making the same mistakes over and over and over again, right? That's the idea of the Examen in a nutshell. So it has roots in ancient Greek and Roman philosophy, but very early on it was picked up as a spiritual practice, as a way to nurture and deepen your life in God. Very early on it was picked up by the early church as a way to deepen our life of prayer and our relationships with God. The person who really put the Examen on the map was St. Ignatius Loyola, who was a Spaniard. He was born in 1491 and died in 1556. St. Ignatius Loyola was one of the great figures from the golden age of Renaissance Spanish spirituality. He was a contemporary of St. Teresa of Avila's and St. John of the Cross and a number of other sort of great luminaries in the tradition in Spain in the 1500s. And Ignatius Loyola was the founder of the Society of Jesus, the Roman Catholic community that we know by its nickname, the Jesuits. Ignatius Loyola founded that Roman Catholic community. And one of the foundations of Ignatian spirituality, the particular way that the Jesuits think and live the Christian life, one of the foundations of their approach is the examen. Ignatius was very, very big on this. Ignatius was an enormously practical man. From a very interesting background. He was a Spanish soldier who was badly wounded in a battle, and during his long and painful hospitalization and recovery, he had a long and sort of very profound conversion experience. But his spirituality was kind of stamped by his great practicality. He was a military man. He liked to get things done. He thought in very concrete, reality-based ways. There is nothing wifty or airy-fairy or tree-hugging about the spirituality of St. Ignatius Loyola. And that's part of why I think the examen was so important to him. I do not intend to be critical about airy-fairy and tree-hugging spirituality like the Franciscans, right? I love those guys, but that's a different thing. So, just a word or two about some of the assumptions that Ignatius and other practitioners of the examen believe. Part of the reason that the examen works is because it fits into our theological understanding as Christians about who God is and how God works. So here are a couple of basic things that we just take for granted about why the examen works. One of the basic assumptions about the examen is you can find God at work in your ordinary day-to-day life. This is very Ignatian. Ignatius was a very practical guy. Ignatius was not the kind of person who felt that it was necessary to go to a mountaintop, hide in a monastery, otherwise go to some wild and extraordinary lengths to pursue and to find God. Ignatius wasn't necessarily against any of that stuff. But his whole approach was that if you know how to look, if you know how to search, if you know what questions to ask, you can discern, you can find God at work in your ordinary day-to-day life, the plain old life that we all live right here in the here and now. And Ignatius felt that you could find God at work both in your outer circumstances. What's going on in your life? What's going on in your calendar? What's going on in your household? And in your inner feelings and dispositions. Both of those things were important to Ignatius. And both of those things, as we'll see, are important to the examen. You need to look in both places. You need to look outside in the circumstances of your life, and you need to look inside into your heart, into your feelings, into your inner experience. And Ignatius and all the practitioners of the examen affirm that you can find God there, right? That if you know how to look and you know what questions to ask, you can discern what God is doing in your life by looking in those two places. The second thing is that just like any of the ancient Stoic philosophers or St. Basil would say, it's good to examine your life so you don't make the same mistakes over and over again. One of the things that makes the examen work is because you really can learn things about yourself and about how God works in your life if you prayerfully, right, meaning God is all involved in the process, If you prayerfully and consistently, i.e. if you try it twice a year, nothing wrong with that, but twice a week is better, and 4 or 5 times a week is really good, right? Consistency is important. If you prayerfully and consistently review, think about, mindfully recall your outer circumstances and your inner feelings and dispositions, you'll learn stuff about how God works in your life. There are clues there. And all of that is true because, God really cares about our outer circumstances and our inner lives. The examen is not just a way of introspection or self-examination for the sake of that. The examen is a way of us putting our faith in and welcoming God's love for us. Because God, if we look, if we know what questions to ask, God is already in the process of revealing to us his love for us in our outer circumstances and in our inner lives. One way to sort of describe this, I've heard it said by a wise Ignatian, that the place where God is going to reveal himself to you is in your life. God is not going to reveal himself, that's too strong. You shouldn't look as the first place that God is going to reveal himself to you in somebody else's life, or in the televangelist on the BookTube, or a cool video on YouTube, or whatever. Again, none of those things are bad. But the place where it's going to happen for you, if you know where to look, if you know what questions to ask, the place where God reveals himself to you is in the unfolding of your own life. Any questions about that? That's kind of a quick introduction here. Yes, please.
Just back to what you were mentioning, the pre-Christian and extra-Judaic tradition. I don't know who it is, maybe you who said as a kind of a lead into this wonderful prayerful examination, the unexamined life is not worth living.
I believe that was Aristotle.
Yeah,
But yeah, exactly right. Yes. I mean, here again, and it's several hundred years before the life of Christ. And he was onto something. He was right. Yeah, absolutely. I think Aristotle? It was either Aristotle or Plato. I think it was Aristotle. Unless it was Thoreau. I mean, when in doubt, I think it's got to be either Plato, Aristotle, or Thoreau. There you go. Other comments or questions about this? Please.
Are there books that talk about the exam? Any resources that you can recommend for this?
There are lots and lots of them. Yes. If you just Google Ignatius Examen or Ignatian Examen, the Jesuits have, because this is their thing, right? This is how they pray. There are great resources on the web about the examen. Yeah, lots of them.
It's a great way to tie in theology and psychology.
Yes.
This is exactly what clients are looking for.
Yeah.
How do I experience it gives that simple, practical application of how to do that in your life.
Yes. Yeah. And those are the sort of fingerprints of St. Ignatius, because he was such a practical guy. I mean, he was. I don't mean this pejoratively. He was not a theologian, meaning he was not the metaphysical theories behind why it works did not interest him. He just wanted to know, what am I going to do today before I have coffee so that I can be a better disciple of Jesus? Right? That was how he approached this. Any other questions about that? Okay. So here's how it works. Here's how you do it. And I'm going to offer you two slightly different models of the examen. I should say there are a million different ways to do this. Once I sort of describe a couple of ways, you'll start to get a feel of what the examen is about. But the exact details vary and should vary from person to person, from era to era. St. Ignatius had a very, very specific step-by-step outline of how to do it. I'm not going to follow his step-by-step outline specifically, but the basic idea of the examen, that you sit down and you think through your life and you ask questions and you search for God's presence and power in what's going on in your life. That's the consistent thread that runs through the whole thing. So here's a couple of ways to do it. First of all, you need to get some tools. Tools are good. Get some tools. Get yourself a good journal or a notebook and a nice pen. Make sure that you like them. Make sure that the notebook and the pen that you're going to work with are cool and fun and a pleasure to use, because you don't want a scratchy ballpoint pen or a notebook with the pages falling out to give you an excuse to avoid doing the examen. I have never experienced this. Of course I have, that's the point. So get yourself some tools and make it easy on yourself. Make them fun to use. Here's how you do it. At the end of the day, and in a few minutes I'll talk through a way of doing the examen that is proper to the morning. But we'll start with the end of the day. That's a little more traditional. Settle down. Take a few deep breaths. We've talked about and experienced some of this in the first couple of our sessions. You need to get ready to pray. You need to park yourself in a comfortable, quiet place, right? You need to turn off the television. You need to do all of that kind of basic stuff that's going to help your mind to ascend to God. You remember the image from the first session about how prayer is just like what happens when you are intensely watching the game and your spouse comes in and asks you a question and you have to refocus your attention very consciously and deliberately. That's what you do when you're getting ready to begin to pray. Quiet down. Take a few deep breaths. Cross the threshold of prayer. Ask for God's help and wisdom. Here's one of my current favorite way of crossing the threshold of prayer. I find that this really works for me. I sit down, I close the door, I take a couple of deep breaths, and I say to God, I am here now praying. Right? I'm here. It's now. It's not last week. It's not tomorrow. It's not any of my other distractions. I'm here now. And because God in his infinite love and mercy has already shown up in my life and wants to be with me, I am here now praying. That, for me, that opens the doors of prayer. So then, thoughtfully review your day from the moment you woke up to the present moment. Again, we're assuming that you're doing this at the end of the day. A monk friend of mine says that the way he sort of envisions this is he is sitting down with a cup of tea and telling God about his day. What happened today? Starting from the beginning. What did you experience? Well, I didn't sleep very well last night. Or I slept really well last night. Or instead of 1 cup of coffee, I had 3, and maybe that wasn't such a good idea. Or, wow, breakfast was wonderful this morning. Or, I had one of those amazingly wonderful, kind of out of nowhere, 5-minute, just wonderful conversations with my wife or my husband that like kind of made my day. And you just walk through your day, one kind of hour or period or experience or piece at a time. What happened? How did you experience? What did you experience? And how did you feel? Well, you know, I overcooked the thing for dinner, and it just made me crazy because I hate it when I do that, and I'm hung up on being perfect about cooking stuff, and you know, it shouldn't be a big deal, but it feels like a big deal to me. I'm making this up. It has nothing to do with my own experience. I'm making this up. So that's what you just walk through your day. What did you experience? How did you feel? Who did you talk to? All of that kind of stuff. You just walk through your day very calmly and quietly and objectively, no being judgy, right? You're just laying it out. You're telling God and yourself about your day. Spend a few minutes doing that. Might take 4, 5, 6, 8 minutes maybe. And then you ask yourself some questions. Here's the heart of the examen. You ask yourself some questions. This is all on the handout, by the way. And there are any number of different questions you can ask yourself that will work. These are just ones that I find especially kind of useful as I'm sort of looking through my day and looking for the pearl of great price buried in the field, right? The chaos of my day is a big muddy field, and somewhere in that field is the pearl of great price of what God is up to and what God wants. And that's what I'm looking for, and that's why I ask the questions. When during the day did I experience the strongest emotion? When did I have the strongest feeling? That feeling may be really positive. I had one of those wonderful 5-minute chats over coffee with Joe that just makes me feel like $1 million. Or maybe that emotion is very negative because I burned the souffle and I just make myself crazy over it, right? Doesn't whether the emotion feels good or feels bad, is positive or negative, that in and of itself doesn't matter. It's just data. Just data for the exam. What was happening at that moment? Why was I feeling that way? And why? And here's the real question. What does that tell me about my character? About my basic approach to life? About how I roll? What does this little experience, this moment in the course of the day when I felt the strongest emotion, what does it have to teach me? Might God have something to say to me about how I think about that strongest feeling moment of the day? Does this show me something about who I am that I feel happy about or grateful for? Maybe it does. I went to the gym the other day, and it's sort of classic for me, right? It's 20 minutes before I'm supposed to be at the gym for my workout. And I hate my life, and I feel terrible, and I wish I were dead, and why can't I just eat a big pile of junk food? That's my standard mindset before my workout, right? 1 hour and 30 minutes later, I'm walking out of the gym and I feel great, okay? Now, right there, if that crops up for me in an examen 4 or 5 times in a row, I'm on to something. Because the next time it's half an hour before I'm due at the gym and I feel like I want to eat junk food and I wish I were dead, I can say to myself, you know what? This is like my thing, right? We've been here before, right? I can just take a deep breath and not get too freaked out about this and go to the gym anyway, because I'm no longer surprised by this particular little bit of crazy. So there's an example of how the examen might work when it's something that I feel happy about, right? I went to the strongest emotion I felt all day was I felt so good half an hour after my workout. Thank you, God, right? And there's a little bonus. I had to push through some stuff to get there. That's really good. That's really helpful. Does this show me something about my character that I could ask God to change or heal? Yes. I am just kind of by nature a pessimistic person. I just am. I come from a long line of anxious Germans. I'm all about the worst case scenario. The motto on the family crest is, if you're not anxious, you're just not paying attention. And that's just kind of how I roll. And again, I know that about myself because I've done enough examen sort of prayer so that I know that that's just a sort of twist in my wiring, and I just kind of have to live with it. And it's not a big deal because I've sort of talked to it and I've kind of made friends with it, and I know that it's something that I can ask God to change or heal, or at least help me roll with, at least help me deal with, right? So to use this example at the end of the day with an examen, the thing that made me feel the best today, God, was I went to the gym. And oh, by the way, I had to push through that usual wall of mild anxiety and depression and ambivalence. And when I tell myself I hate the gym, which is really not true, but that's what I tell myself half an hour before a workout. And thank you, God, for enabling me to push through that. And help me maybe to be a little bit less sucked into that particular mental trap before tomorrow's workout. That's the examen at work. Does that make sense? You sort through your life and you're looking for, this is a terrible way to put it, but I think it makes some sense. You're looking for the target for your prayer. You're looking for where you're going to ask God to bring strength and healing and forgiveness and growth to your life. You do the examen, you ask yourself those questions, now you know exactly what to pray about. Now you got the target, right? The target was that moment in the day when I felt this way because this was happening, and you know what, that says something to me about myself. So how can I invite God into that? And maybe the thing that you come up with, the strongest emotion that you felt in the course of the day, maybe it was wonderful. Maybe the strongest emotion you felt was, you hadn't talked to your closest friend for a month, and you get on it and you spend an hour on the phone with that person, and you hung up the phone, and you just felt such love for this person who has been a fixture in your life for 30 years, right? What a great thing to pray about in the examen. Thank you, God, for my friend Betty, who has been in my life for 30 years, and for everything she's meant to me. That's a great thing. Regardless of whether or not my examen has focused on a part of my day that felt great or maybe didn't feel so great to me, I always conclude with gratitude. There's always something to be grateful for. Even if I had a terrible day, I'm sitting now before God and I'm going through my day and I'm letting God's grace and love and mercy come to me. And that, even if the rest of the day was a disaster, that's something to be grateful for. And the traditional way to end the examen is by praying the Lord's Prayer. Ignatius suggested sort of summing up your examen prayer by praying the Lord's Prayer. Once you kind of get used to the sort of rhythm of this and how it works, you won't have to sort of remember the steps. It won't seem forced. After you do this 3 or 4 times, it becomes very natural. It kind of starts to make emotional sense to you. And you can do it pretty thoroughly in 10 or 15 minutes. It doesn't take a long time to do. And the last thing I'll say about it is jot down some notes or write in a journal. If you can do that on a fairly consistent basis, you'll find it incredibly helpful. Especially if you pick up your notes and read back a month. And you go, right, God and I have had this conversation, right? I've run into this situation in my life already. I know about this particular, quirk for me, this thing that kind of makes me crazy, and I kind of know why, and it actually happened 2 weeks ago, and God and I talked about this, and here's what I learned about this, and here's how I know I can ask God to kind of keep me from running off the rails next time this comes up. I have a very poor memory for that sort of stuff, but if I look back in my journal a couple of weeks or a couple of months, wow, the stuff I learned. It's amazing. So that's how the examen works. That's what it's about. In a minute, I'll give you a slightly different version of the examen for the morning as opposed to the traditional time in the evening. But before I do that, I want to just ask for questions or comments or just what you think here. Please.
So, I know you're going to get to the morning. This is our evening examen.
Mm-hmm.
What about if we're feeling something very anxious, let's say in the middle of the day?
Uh-huh.
Do you suggest that we just pause and think and do a reflection then? Or do you think it's just...
Absolutely, yes. If you have time to do it, like right there on the spot, that's really helpful. Yes, I would never just limit it to just the evening. Classic example. I'm on the freeway, in traffic, on the 210 in Pasadena. I've been driving from Lake Arrowhead to get to my appointment in Glendale, let's say, right? And I left the house 10 minutes later than I really should have. And the traffic is worse than I expected. Big surprise, right? Okay? And I'm freaking out in the car. Freaking out in the car because I'm going to an appointment that's important with somebody that is important to me, and it already looks like I'm going to be 15 minutes late. Okay? And I am a mess. I am a mess. So, a little example. Okay, so now right there, if I have sufficient spiritual wherewithal to take a deep breath and pray in traffic in the car, as opposed to just like ranting at the drivers in the other cars, if I can just get that far, that's a big win, right? So maybe I take this a step further and I take a couple of deep breaths and I say, God, I am probably going to be 15 minutes late for my appointment with Steve, and I am freaking out. Why am I freaking out? How did I get myself into this mess? Well, number one, okay, it's confession time. I left the house 15 minutes later than I knew I should. Why? Because I was mindlessly web surfing when I should have been getting ready to go. Okay, that's some helpful knowledge. Next question, why am I having this feeling? Why am I so anxious? Why does this feel to me like the end of the world, even though I'm only going to be 15 minutes late for an appointment, right? But it feels like the end of the world. Well, because my friend Steve is really important to me, and because, here again, I just know this about myself, I just assume that no one gives me any grace for anything, because why would they? I'm I don't give myself any grace. That's God's job, right? God can give me grace, I can't. Or as I like to say, progress, not perfection, gets you fired. Right? And these are the tapes that play in my head, right? So if I can take a couple of deep breaths and ask myself some questions, and I can figure out that, I am telling myself the story that I know my friend Steve loves me, right? That's why he's one of my closest friends. He is not going to turn the table over and throw me out of the restaurant if I'm 15 minutes late for an appointment. It's gonna be okay, right? So I pray about this and I sort myself out. And lo and behold, the idea comes to me that I could send Steve a text, right? Without picking up my phone, because I'm trying to be a good guy, right? I have those set up in my car. And so I send Steve a text. I'm shaking with anxiety. And I say, I'm running 15 minutes late. And he texts back and says, I'm so glad because I'm running 20. And anxiety bubble bursts, right? And I say, thank you, God. Right? I just learned all kinds of stuff about myself. I fixed a problem in a very, very practical way. And life is good. I don't even remember how I got off on that rant, but I get that that's an example of how the examen works. Oh, yeah, and you asked the question. So, morning examen, great. Evening examen, great. But it's 2 in the afternoon and my life goes off the rails. What do I do?
Mm-hmm.
There you go. Please.
It's